I listen to so many podcasts that they're very scientific and they love to put numbers on food intake and calorie intake and energy output and all this stuff. And I listen to them and I'm like, these are not useful to the majority of races because they presume that everyone is a robot and has like no emotional attachment to food and no feelings towards their own body image and stuff. And I find that really frustrating.
Hello and welcome back to the Contour Collective's Derailed podcast. My name's Morgan and this week I'm talking with Isla Short. I've known Isla for quite a few years. She's one of the UK's top cross-country mountain bikers and we had a great conversation. There's a lot more to athletes than just race results, and that's certainly the case with Isla. We talk about why she got into riding, we talk about what inspired her, we talk about women's sport, we talk about some of the challenges she faced as a woman in mountain biking. We talk about discrimination, we talk about her research into the Black Lives Matter movement and what she thinks can be done in mountain biking to help make it a more diverse community. It is certainly not one at the moment. It's a super complicated issue, obviously, but I think it starts with the conversation, which is what we're talking about. We talk about diet, we talk about some of the challenges Isla's faced in not being too obsessive over her diet, and we talk about some of the more negative psychological aspects of racing at the level she is racing at. We have a great conversation. I think you're going to really enjoy it. If you do, please like, comment, and subscribe. We greatly appreciate your comments. We will answer your questions, and if you subscribe to this channel, you will immediately get all of our videos, which is a good thing because they are good videos. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy this conversation with Isla Short. Isla, how are you?
Morgan, I'm good, thanks. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm excited. We usually have pretty good conversations, so I'm excited for this one. I'm just aware that Crystal's trying to keep it into an hour.
Okay.
So I'm going to try and be more disciplined, certainly, than our last podcast, which was 3 hours.
Was it 3 hours? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
You did have a lot to say.
I did have a lot to say, yes.
Yeah, maybe if you just don't interrupt me this time, I won't be fine.
How was your weekend?
It was good, yeah. I was doing some big training rides. I actually just did my biggest ever training week kind of by accident, which was nice. But yeah, it was like super cold, super nice, and good.
How are you finding this second lockdown?
Harder than the last one, for sure.
Really?
Yeah, I think like the first one, it was something new, wasn't it? It was like an opportunity to do different stuff and to like slow down, whereas because we've been doing that for the past year or wherever, and also it's a lot easier when the weather's nicer. Like I've definitely found doing more training is helping me because it's like a distraction. But obviously in the summer I could just extend my ride for like an hour or two longer to stay out. But here, because it's so cold, it's like harder to do that. But
yeah, I've definitely found this one a lot tougher as well. I'm so excited for spring. Like usually it's pretty exciting, the idea of spring, but anytime, like today it was a little bit warm and the sun was out, and I'm like, I don't know. You have to remember though, it's January, so it's not.
Yeah. Like the lack of sunlight has never bothered me in years before, but it really has affected my general well-being this year, and I've like the first time I've ever noticed it bothering me.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's just super. It's weird the effect it's having on all of us, and we probably won't even really know until we're out of it, and you'd be like, oh man, I was quite kind of, and because it doesn't seem too bad, but it is definitely like it's a bit of a weight on all of us, isn't it?
Yeah, I just think there's this constant underlying anxiety that we never had before, and it's like it makes me a lot less resilient for things to come up out of like unexpected things happening. Like I can't deal with them as well as I could before, just because I'm constantly feeling like I'm just tired and like mentally tired.
That's interesting. Okay, so we'll maybe talk a bit more about that, but I wanted to start with just a little bit about your background. We talked about pretty much everything in the last podcast I did with you, but I want to, it's still worth obviously going into it. Most people wouldn't have heard it. So can you just tell us a little bit about how and why you got into mountain biking?
Yeah, so I come from a super outdoorsy family, which is the primary reason why I'm super into the outdoors now. My family holidays were all spent on a triplet and a tandem in France, Germany, and Scotland, with my older sisters and my mum and dad. And because I grew up with this, I was just surrounded by nature and adventure all the time. It's just become like a really natural love of mine. And then I got into mountain biking specifically through my dad, who did kind of ultra endurance events and was a bit of a beast at them. So I got to see him training for them. I got to kind of see his racing from the sidelines and realized it was something I wanted to do as well. So yeah, because I had a dad who kind of knew about bike tech and knew what races were happening, I was able to get on board with that and go to those races and compete myself. And it's kind of just been like a really organic process since then. It's never been about winning races or it being my job specifically. It's just that I really love riding a bike, and in particularly like off road. So it's just felt really natural.
Was that something, did you want to start racing, or was your dad kind of not like pushing you into it, but was he like, oh, you could do a race, or was it coming from yourself?
No, I think it definitely came from me. Like I don't know why I ended up being the daughter that went to all the races with him. My two sisters were like never really that bothered, and I think it was nice for him to be able to share that with one of his children.
When he he was racing and you were going along to the races
Yeah.
watching him?
Yeah, so
Okay.
when he would do kind of the 10-hour events, I would be in charge of getting his food ready each time he came around, and like making sure his clothes were sorted and stuff. And it was really nice to have that kind of role, because then it switched afterwards. But yeah, there was no real pressure from him for me to compete. It was very much like, oh, can we do this race as a pair rather than watching him do it solo? And then
Was he? I take it, was he quite a role model to you then when you were young?
in some ways, well, to be honest, a lot of it is like I don't agree with a lot of his views on like how things are done, like in terms of maybe bike setup or race prep. Like he's always still has this kind of, because he's less involved now than he used to be, because it is my job and there's obviously the support network has grown. There's still a little part of him which wants to have that element of control. So he's always like, yes, yeah, so what's your taper look like this week for the race? And I'm like, well, I can tell you about it, but you don't understand. But he loves it, so it's cool.
That's cool. How many races does he come with you to now?
Not very many, because he's working full time. But he would like to come to a lot more. He's actually only been to 2 World Cups, I think. Which is kind of weird because he's such a massive part of the reason that I'm doing World Cups. But he's got this crazy plan. When he retires, he wants to do a cycle tour of Europe and basically have stop-offs at all my World Cups. That's his big retirement plan.
Can you remember then? I suppose actually my next question is pretty much it's been answered. Like, can you remember what it was that inspired you? It sounds like it was your dad. You were exposed to from as early as you can remember, almost.
Yeah, I think that, and also I was never in school. I was kind of like a pretty average student. I never latched onto a hobby really, or a specific thing that I was really passionate about until I found mountain biking, which wasn't until I was 14 or 15. So I think, like a lot of kids kind of have their thing, whether it's like athletics or football, and just like a thing they do. And I didn't really like find that thing until I was a bit older. So then once I found that, I knew, and that was when I also found the first like kind of really like long-term like nice friendships as well through that. So I think it just became like, it was a lot more than racing, and it still is. It's like it was a social existence and it started to become like quite a big part of what I wanted to identify with. And that's just what's like drawn me in through the past decade, basically.
How old was it then that started to, because you studied music, yeah, the harp. So how old were you when it kind of shifted to your world being kind of centered around mountain biking, as opposed to, because you were actually away at a boarding school for music until you were 13 or 14, did you say?
Yeah, so I was at the music school until I was 14, and it was my last year there where I really started to see that the world of mountain biking and bike racing was like a thing I wanted to explore. And that clashed massively with my life at the time, because I was at a boarding school which was specifically for aspiring musicians, and that wasn't what I wanted to do anymore. But it was not centered around sports at all, and sports didn't really fit into that lifestyle. So that's when I ended up having this massive shift in, like, not just in what I was doing at that age, but in my trajectory, because it was just totally different. I suddenly wanted to be outside all the time and pursue this thing that I had never really had the opportunity to do in the past however many years I'd been at that school, because it was so intensely focused.
Do you think that your journey into the sport was different as a young girl as it might have been as a young boy?
Yes, definitely. In terms of, obviously, the number of girls riding bikes is a lot smaller, and that's kind of the most obvious thing. And for me, when I look back on me developing as a young rider, there's only really one girl who I can remember like having that development with. Whereas I imagine if I was a boy, there would probably be a group of riders all kind of pushing each other on. Whereas for me, it was like and this girl happened to be my best friend as well. So it was nice because it was quite simple, but at the same time, there were just not enough of us pushing each other on. And I think that's changing a little bit now. And I think it's really interesting how, like, where that change comes from, because the change has to happen at grassroots level for riders to develop and progress and be competing at a higher level, or not even competing, just participating in more numbers. But I have quite clearly seen through the past few years that the kind of progression that we've seen in girls riding bikes, it almost comes from the role models at the top of the sport. So it's quite interesting where, like, what has to come first in that respect.
So you think it's like it's a top down sort of thing?
It feels like it, yeah. It definitely, from when I started racing, so in the past decade, or like 7 or 8 years maybe, it's definitely felt like the inspiration for the numbers to increase and for that move to be made has come from women's XC racing in particular becoming really exciting. And, you know, like right now there's probably 15 riders who could podium on any given day. There's probably 10 of those riders could actually win. So, and I see that, you know, when chatting to people, there's so many, all the chat is around how exciting women's racing is. And I think that's what girls want to talk about, which I think is really cool.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's like it's a sort of, they each sort of feed each other. So the more competitive it is at the top level and the more role models there are for young girls, then the more inspiration there is for other like younger ones, you know, getting into it. And then so it's more competitive at like grassroots as well, which is then, you know, it's like, it's funny how much do you think it's changed in the time that you've, like, since you started women's mountain biking? I
think it's changed a lot at the top level. I think that's been quite clear from, you'd get, when I first started racing World Cups, you'd have like the same 2 riders winning every World Cup, and some of them would win by like minutes, and it was pretty boring to watch. Whereas now, like I said, it's somebody different almost every week. And then at the grassroots level, I don't know whether it's just because I'm a lot more involved with the bigger picture grassroots than I was when I was that age, because it was very much about me just going to my weekly thing or whatever. But now it's like, I think a big thing is when you have more riders at the top level, there's more riders, say, within a country. So the level of XC mountain biking is the highest it's ever been in the UK right now. So there's like a couple of us who are in different areas who are promoting that sport in that area and are able to, go out with a couple of girls riding. And I didn't really have that when I was younger. There was no one in Scotland that I looked up to that could like organize a day or guest at a coaching session or something. Whereas now, over the years, you've kind of got, you've got me, Evie, and Annie who can do that for younger riders coming through. You've got people like Tracy Mosley who are now retired, who are able to like transition into a role of like coaching the next generation. And I just think having an increase in the number of riders who have the resource to do that, that's changed a lot in the past 10 years, I would say.
Were there any other sort of major challenges, either with like gender or just other challenges, you faced like coming into the sport? What were they?
I think the main fight, which I've always felt has had an impact on how I've been able to take my own like place in professional sport seriously, or not even professional sport, just in sport as a woman, is the kind of the fight for where the elite women's place is within the sport. For example, if you take a race like a Scottish race weekend, a cyclocross race, because this is kind of like been an ongoing issue in that race series, is historically the women have started behind the junior men, so the elite women behind the junior men, and often would get less prize money than the winning junior man. And that's always been difficult for me, because I've always been very ambitious with what I want to do with it, with my racing, and to go to a race as somebody who's already on a professional team, is trying to make a living out of the sport, and is told to line up behind a bunch of 17-year-old boys who are still in school. That's very hard, because it's a very clear, like, we don't take you seriously. Whereas the elite men, there would be no question about that. Race would be, at the center of the race weekend, and the prize money would all be kind of centered around that. So stuff like that I find really difficult, because you can only take yourself as seriously as other people take you. And I think as a woman, like, especially not really at a professional level, mountain biking is, the prize money is equal in UCI events. And I would say there's been like a couple small things with the World Cup schedule. The men's race is always the last race of the weekend, which I think potentially they could switch it about, because I think more people are watching women's XC than they have in a long time. The women's XC has arguably been more exciting over the past few years. So I'm hoping that over the next few years there'll be this change where it's like the men's race will stop being thought of as the main event, because it still is a massive problem, even though you've had the same man winning for 3 or 4 years.
What do you think then the argument are there? What are their reasons for doing it at that local level, grassroots level?
I guess numbers. Their argument before was that if you only have 20 women in a race, they can't justify giving us our own race. They have to put it in with another category, which I don't think that is a valid argument at all, because it's like we were saying earlier, like, it's got to come from both sides. How are you going to encourage more women to compete in a race where they're just being lumped in with the guys? And if they're not getting their own time to shine within a race weekend, like that, the incentive is less there. And for me, because this is my job and I need to make money from it, for me to go and win 20 quid for winning an elite women's race as a top 10 rider in the world against a guy who is like a very good Scottish rider winning an elite Scottish race, but only races in Scotland, and he's winning £80. Like, it doesn't make any sense. And still struggle to see the only basis for it is that it's what's always been done, and people are unwilling to change things.
It is as well that, like, because I suppose the argument would be, well, it's not as competitive in this field, so it makes more sense if there's numbers or whatever. But you're not going to make it more competitive by sort of diminishing the results of the women in that way, and you're only going to make it more competitive by making it equal to the men. And it has to, like, if that's the only thing really in anyone's control is the actual prize money, like from the event, as opposed to, we'll wait until there's it is like more competitive or something.
Yeah, and I think a lot, because word of mouth is so big, like if as a woman you have a really good experience at a race and you're treated equally and the prize money is the same and you get your own start time and the commentary is appropriate and not using words to describe the women that they would never describe it for the men and stuff, like you're gonna say to people, oh, I really enjoyed this race, I had a really positive experience, and more women are going to want to go to that. Whereas if you come away from an event and you're like, do you know what, it was like very centered around the men, like we didn't really get much attention, we felt like a side event, women are going to be like, that sounds horrible, I don't want to go to that. So I do think it's really important.
Is that something you kind of was a challenge when you were younger? Or because I'd imagine actually what you're talking about now at the level you're at, it's actually it feels more almost humiliating now to put in the work you have and to be, come 5th at the World Champs in October, and then to be going, next to like the 17-year-old boys who are at high school. I imagine it's a bigger issue for you now than it was when you were younger.
Yeah, when I was younger, it didn't, like, it bothered me, but I didn't have maybe the platform or the confidence, or I didn't understand how I felt about the situation properly to voice my feelings on it. Whereas now, yeah, I don't think I'd even race if I was put in behind the junior men. I think I would take a stand and I wouldn't race, because I think there comes a point where it doesn't just make me look stupid, it actually makes the whole thing look stupid.
Yeah, totally. When I read your Wide Open magazine interview, and you mentioned sort of tackling issues of discrimination or things in the sport that were like bigger than yourself, and there's a couple of things actually from that I want to bring up. But I wondered, is this the sort of issue of discrimination that you feel is a problem?
Actually, no. The main thing that I've kind of engaged with, obviously gender equality within sport is a thing that needs tackled, but I became like really engaged with the Black Lives Matter movement after George Floyd was killed in May last year. And I think it was a couple of different things. Lockdown kind of made me develop this need to explore something bigger than my own personal goals, especially because I was in this place where my own goals were like up in the air, and I didn't know if the races were going to happen. And my boyfriend was, leaving every day to be a key worker and go and kind of do greater good for the world at that point. And my job was to not get COVID. And I just started to feel like pretty small and useless, and just felt like I needed to learn about something bigger than professional sport. So yeah, I just started reading a lot of books on racial discrimination, and I just have that interest has kind of developed and grown arms and legs a little bit, and now I'm just like really interested in the future for me, sort of when I move away from professional racing, doing something which is basically going to create access to not to race, because I think that's like a very small part of what mountain biking and what cycling can bring to people, but it's bringing the sport that I love so much to the lives of people who right now cannot access it for various reasons. And for me, that is probably at the minute centered around Black people and people of color, because I didn't realize quite how white my world was until I started looking into it. and especially my world in cycling.
And what do you think would be, I mean, it's a big issue to even, try and tackle, because there's so many, like I was the same, like with the George Floyd protests. I was actually in Minnesota, and I remember like, okay, like I need to find out, just felt like there was a certain like obligation to at least like to read more into it, to know a lot more about it. And yeah, you kind of assume in some ways like Scotland is like a very kind of white country, and the problems, the more obvious problems, are more like income inequality and things, as opposed to like race layered on top of those other problems. So yeah, super complicated. I don't want to like put you on the spot. What are you going to do about it? But what do you think, or where would you even like? I mean, you were talking in the future, obviously, perhaps, or where do you think it begins? Like, how do you start to do something about that?
Yeah, I think that is an easier question to answer than what are you going to do about it? Because I don't want to, like, I have not been I've not engaged with much out with my own personal bubble in life until recently. So I'm very new to, like, I don't know, big issues basically. Like, and I'm not afraid to admit that. I think more of us should actually admit to being ignorant rather than pretending that we know things that we don't know anything about. Because up until less than a year ago, I thought being racist was saying horrible things to somebody, which now I understand is a lot more complicated than that. But basically, I think doing things like this is the best place to start, whether that's on a podcast or just with a friend, or, with somebody that you've never discussed, someone that you just, if a conversation is, say, normally centered around how your bike works, or, for example, with my mechanic, we've had some really interesting conversations about racism that we never would have had before last year. And it's just bringing up these topics in different circumstances and different situations, and not being afraid to bring them up because it's not the right time or it's not the right place. Because I think that's what stops a lot of people talking about it, is that it is as people would describe, like a heavy topic. And I'm like, I don't really like that word, because if these discussions don't happen, particularly among like middle class white people, need to be having more of these conversations with each other, I think, and like raw conversations, like honest conversations, where we start to admit that we do. For me, like my world of cycling, I realized I had never had a proper conversation with a Black person or a person of color, possibly once when I was very young at school, and I certainly have never spoken to a Black cyclist, or even come across a Black cyclist or a person of color who rides a bike. And I've been racing World Cups for 7 or 8 years, and that kind of terrified me, because I realized how white the culture of racing and cycling is. So yeah, I just think having conversations is the best way to start. Reading books, which I've done a lot of, and weirdly, it was crazy timing. Just after World Champs, I had a heap of messages and comments and emails from people, and I had to be pretty selective about what I responded to, just because there's only so much time in the day. And I had an email from this one girl from Kenya who just said she was a fan and she wanted to have a video call. And I was like, yeah, this could be quite cool. It's kind of in line with, like, I probably wouldn't have engaged with that before I'd kind of engaged with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I was like, you know what, this is a person from a completely different path in life, but she rides a bike, so we have this thing in common. And we ended up having a chat on Zoom or whatever, and I think I've spoken to her every single day since then, and that was in November. And she's become one of my closest friends, even though I've never met her.
That's funny.
Um,
Where did she's from Kenya, did you say?
yeah, so she's half Arab, half Kenyan. She lives in Kenya, and she identifies as Black, and she races kind of locally, but obviously the infrastructure there is just it's not what it is here. So that's been really special for me to engage with, not just because she's a really amazing person that I would never have crossed paths with otherwise, but also just because it's allowed me to see cycling in a much bigger way than my own racing, and to understand as well that even though I sometimes feel like my job is very self-involved and self-centered, I have helped somebody from across the world or inspired this person, and it's a really cool relationship because she says to me like, oh, you it's so cool that we're friends, and like you're such an inspiration, and I kind of have to be like to her and like, no, you're an inspiration. Like she just emailed this person she saw race on the TV, and like I just think it's so cool, and to have a relationship with somebody like that I can talk about these real issues with and understand cycling from a much wider point of view is really special.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, that is, as much as sport is on the one hand, especially at the kind of elite level, is, self-indulgent or self-absorbed, because, a lot of athletes' motivation is largely like they want to just beat other people around a track, downhill or whatever. But the power of it is, like we were saying, like the power of having powerful kind of, like especially, for women, it's the same for boys. It's more taken for granted for guys, but like the power of having these like strong kind of characters in sport, and then wanting to be like them and be physical and
Yeah.
is really powerful, especially for someone like yourself in a sport like, or as a woman in a sport like mountain biking. And then going beyond, you can obviously have an impact in of people all over the world too.
Yeah, no, I think it's highlighted that sport, because what I do is very well, you have to have those opportunities early on to be able to progress to where I am with it now, and it can feel very like a bubble and isolated from the real world, and in a lot of ways that's nice, because it's you get up each day and you think about your training and what you're going to eat, and you're not worrying about these like real world issues. But at the same time, by doing this and like living this kind of lifestyle, despite not feeling like this in the summer at all, I have realized now that especially something like World Champs, which I think, because there was a lot of criticism about whether racing should have gone ahead, but I know what those 3 weeks of racing did, not just for people back at home, but for example, Eman, my Kenyan friend, like I have now developed like a really close, I think, lifelong friendship from those 3 weeks of racing. So all those days in the summer where I got up and thought about myself every day, it's not really about finishing fifth at Worlds. It's about, changing, it sounds dramatic, but like changing the life of somebody across the world, because we now have this connection that we would have never had. So I think it's a much bigger thing than it sometimes feels like professional racing.
Totally, yeah. And the more of a platform you have, the more you can talk about these things, and that is the power of it. Certainly, it's like you can talk and inspire. Let's talk about that World Champs result then, because it was. I remember looking on. I think the XC was started before the downhill, didn't it? It was a couple of weeks before the downhill World Champs. And I remember going on pink bike and like, you go and see the top 5, and you started this whole string of Scottish riders just doing like mind-blowingly well. Because I'll go into pink bike, look at my phone, you see just the top 5 on the thing. So I was like, oh, I'll see how Isla got on the XC. And I didn't expect to see your name at the top, right on the front page. So what? I don't know. I've got so many questions about it. What did it mean to you for a start? What was it like?
It's been a really hard thing to process, because I went from I'm actually shaking talking about it. I went excitement? just like feels. Yeah, because I went for such like 8 months or whatever. You'll understand this because you've raced at a high level. It's like you get so used to living in this emotional bubble where you're either at one end or the other of the spectrum. And even though it's quite exhausting being like on top of the world or just like really, really down and in a not a good place with it. But I didn't realize how much I relied on that and how used to that I was. So I found the kind of 7 months of lockdown and no racing leading into those races hard because I was kind of numb a little bit. And so going into probably the most like emotionally intense 3 weeks of my life in a racing context, and then having to come home and go back into a full lockdown, it kind of totally messed up. Like I couldn't reflect on it properly because it was almost like it didn't happen. But I still have to remember that happened, and that's why I think when I hear someone else say like, yeah, it's everything kind of comes back. But to be honest, it's because a lot of people thought it was kind of unexpected. And I guess it was a little bit, but 5 years ago, I probably could have said to myself, that is where I know I can be, and that is where I want to be. So if it happens, I'm not going to be surprised because I already believe it. So that's kind of how it felt. It was kind of just relief because it had taken me a long time to get there, even though I'd never doubted that I would get there. But when it happens, it's like, it's almost just like a weight's lifted. That's
Yeah, it's like you because you knew you could do it. The pressure was almost a slightly negative pressure. It would be I'm going to beat myself up if I don't do that, as opposed to like, oh my, like,
yeah.
So it was just like, oh good, I don't have to beat myself up. Was it like,
yes,
is that what you mean?
Yes,
That's
it was like I sort of feel there's this point in my brain where I no longer am trying to prove something to myself or to other people. And I feel like that race was kind of the point where I was like, okay, I know I can be one of the best now. Everyone else knows. Now I can kind of just focus on trying to be the best rather than trying to prove something. And the best part of it was, which I think is kind of like sums up what racing is to me. Just after the race, the British cycling coach was at the finish line and he gave me a hug and like picked me up. And it was just like a super emotional moment. And then we went back to the vans. This is like 10 minutes after the race. And he picked me up again. He was so excited. And then he started crying. And I think seeing someone else cry about your own achievement is really mind blowing. Like, because people don't talk about how they feel very often. So sometimes you don't realize how much somebody is emotionally invested in you until you see them just like crack with emotion.
Do you think that's what? Because I remember having this conversation quite recently, actually. You know, like actors will win an Oscar or just someone does well and they say like it's so humbling, and I'm always watching like, I'm like, shut up, like this is the least humbling moment of your life. But I think I remember when being at Fort William when Reece Wilson came fourth at the World Cup, like 2017, I think it was, and he was crying on the podium, and it was a really like endearing thing to see, because, and it is humbling, like to cry obviously is kind of humbling, because I think in those moments you realize, like, I'm guessing anyway, I never had any of these moments myself, but like you realize how lucky you are, I suppose, to maybe have it, and then maybe as well like how much like other people are invested in that achievement of yours as well. Did you feel humbled?
Yeah, I did. Like I genuinely did, because I think especially with someone like the GB coach, we've had a pretty complex relationship over the years, and there's been a lot of it's felt a lot like fighting against each other a little bit, in terms of me trying to prove something to them and all that. So it's like at that moment, it was Scott, my boyfriend, described it as the coach permanently moving into my camp. And that's what it felt like. It stopped being about, oh, I've proved this to you. And it suddenly became, look at what we've done together. Look at what all the kind of difficulties we've had. It's come to this moment. And it just made me realize that results they're only special when you share them with people and when you acknowledge the people who have been a part of it. I don't think I would get any joy out of that result if I didn't share it with all the people who'd been part of that. I don't see, which is why, different topic, but which is why I can't get my head around doping, for example, because I genuinely, the best part of achieving something you've always wanted is.
But what about the doctors? they work as a team.
True.
No, I absolutely agree. In line with that, I want to talk to you a little bit about something we've talked a lot about is kind of the highs and lows of racing, and then also some of the sort of like negative, maybe I don't know if it's habits you pick up just from going at something so intensely, and like it's very hard not to attach yourself to completely. You're completely attach yourself to each race result. You said as well in that interview, you talked about the emotional summits and depths of racing, and that I like that quote. Tell us about the emotional summits and depths of racing.
That's
It wasn't a very specific question.
It wasn't.
I can make it more specific if you want.
That would help.
Okay, right. Talk about some of the negative aspects. Or I think I'm more interested not so much in like the downsides of racing, but more in like in how it affects your psychology. Like some of the sort of more negative aspects of like the psychological effect of competing at that level all the time.
So I think for me personally, the main thing with racing is I think anyone to get to a certain level has to be obsessive at some point and has to be very one-track minded and be selfish. I don't see how you can be at that level without having some aspects of that. But I do think it can be managed. And I think some people manage it well and some people don't. And I would have said up until the past year, I didn't manage it very well. And that was having this, because I always believed that I could be the best. There's a fine line between believing and expecting, but not expecting in the way like I am better than other people. It's more expecting it of yourself. And we've discussed this in the past a little bit. I think like if you don't do what you set out to do that season or at that race, like you can beat yourself up so hard to the point where you're getting further and further down this hole of obsession and finding things that are not even relevant, but that you can change to make yourself a better rider, and neglecting other aspects of your life that weirdly are probably the missing part of your racing. So up until last year and maybe the last 2 years, I put no effort into life outside racing because I didn't understand how that was relevant to me going faster. And I have become quite an introvert in like the past however many years of racing, and I'm like pretty happy with being an introvert, but I understand that introverts also need people now, which I didn't get before. And I think it sounds really cliched, but a lot of athletes you see who maybe have this one amazing season, but they can't sustain a really successful career over a long time is because they don't have balance. And I think in order to learn balance, you have to first go to that place where you don't have it. So for me, like big changes I've made in order to make me a happier person, regardless of the race results and the performances, is creating interesting things in my life out with racing and understanding why I like riding a bike and why I race in the first place. And a lot of that is, it can be really little things, like if I have a big training week and I'm not feeling that motivated, or I'm struggling with my self-confidence because my last race was a bad result, rather than like throw myself into training that week, I'll say, okay, I'm going to do some of my rides this week with people rather than by myself, because I'm like very bad for just doing all my training by myself, because I think that people get in the way of me training properly. But
Yeah.
I have been like more relaxed about, I don't want to say more relaxed because it sounds like I've slacked, but
It doesn't sound like
see, this is like exactly what I mean.
Yeah, exactly. No, it doesn't.
Like, I've been more relaxed with like my sleep, my social life, my rigidity. I can't say that word. Like how rigid I am with my training than I ever have been in the like the summer leading up to World Champs. And I now like train better than I ever have. I sleep better than I ever have, and I performed better than I ever have. And it's just crazy how the more you latch on to these things that you think are going to make you better, they're almost always going to make you worse. And it's really hard when you're in that negative spiral, especially when, for example, I wasn't eating very well a couple of seasons ago, in terms of I wasn't eating enough, and I wasn't eating enough variety. I wasn't allowing myself certain food groups because I thought they would make me gain weight, they would make me slow on the climbs. And if you get one bad result, you think you're not doing enough of that thing. So then you keep doing it more and more, and then suddenly you find yourself in this place that you cannot get out of without outside help. And
I think,
yeah, it's just a really, like, I see it a lot with other athletes now, and it's something else I feel quite strongly about, is the conversation around food, especially because it's very easy to go down that path, and it's very, very hard to turn back when you're on it.
Yeah, that's another thing I want to talk to you about, actually, because that's something as well. We've talked about, like, what you were saying recently about food. I find myself constantly, and I don't know if it was something that I made worse through racing and being sort of too obsessive about it. And now I have like these sort of like tendencies towards obsessiveness about like foods and whatever, even though like rationally it's like your thing about carbs and wide open or whatever. And I've got these things where it's like I need to eat like different types of carbohydrate. Like I can't have like just the same type of carbohydrate all day. And it's just all these like, and then if I have like, I wondered, do you think, is that something that was brought on by competing, or do you think that was in you beforehand, these like tendencies towards obsessiveness that can become, if there's an unhealthy side to competing, it's like, because the end of the line and those sorts of like habits, those obsessiveness is like serious eating disorders and like
Yeah.
and things like that. Do you think that was something that that was brought about by racing, or something that was there before?
I think obsessive tendencies, I think they were always there, because I think that's why I had the drive in the first place. But the eating in particular was brought on by comments, and I think there's kind of two things. I would really love to speak to some males who've struggled with eating problems within sport. So anyone who's listening, hit me up, because I have had like no feedback from males, and it's really frustrating, because I can then only talk about females, and then I'm worried about males being like, yes, but this is a male problem too. So that's another thing. But I think like I've never struggled with it from a aesthetic point of view. I've never thought that I I didn't look in shape or I looked overweight or whatever. It was very performance focused, and it was because from a very young age racing, it was quite obvious that I was a good climber. But a lot of that is to do with, I'm light because I'm really small. And, everyone has different engines and different strengths. And climbing happened to be a thing that I was noticeably better at than my peers when we were still all developing. So that kind of, you get this first, it's like, it's meant to be positive reinforcement, but then it becomes, oh, because you're a really good climber and your bike's really light, like you as a package needs to be really light. And sometimes I started to realize like these were the comments that were making me think and about not wanting that extra portion, because I had to play to my strengths and I had to climb faster than everyone. And when I questioned people about it, when I kind of understood it, the response would always be like, oh, we don't mean you, we just mean the bike. But that's like, science is like, I'm going up the hill too, so I also need to be light. So it was very, very based on, again, just how can I win this bike race? And I had to get kind of outside help to get through that with nutritionists and psychologists, and like I'm very lucky to have access to that. But I think, again, like the discrimination conversations, I think more important, you don't need to necessarily have professionals to help you as an athlete to get through this. I think it's like more women and men having conversations about how complex relationships with food are. And I listen to so many podcasts that they're very scientific and they love to put numbers on food intake and calorie intake and energy output and all this stuff. And I listen to them and I'm like, these are not useful to the majority of races, because they presume that everyone is a robot and has like no emotional attachment to food and no feelings towards their own body image and stuff. And I find that really frustrating.
Yeah, totally. It is. I think it is something that affects. I would imagine it affects males as much as women. I don't know I wonder if it's one of these things where, as you say, the conversation is it that men are less willing to talk about it. It's more okay for women to talk about like issues around like how I look, or like I don't want to. Whereas for men, maybe they're not having the conversations. But we do. Yeah, everyone's talking about nutrition, but not a lot of people know very much about it. And I'm not even sure, like I remember hearing someone saying it's a very hard thing to study scientifically. Like there's so many different variables and it's so hard to make a controlled study on people's diet, especially like long term. So there's so much nonsense around it. And like I personally can be quite susceptible to things I hear, or do you know, like what's the word?
Yeah.
There's a word for it.
Impressionable.
even though I don't want to be, but like naturally, like I hear something and it plays on my mind, and then that can affect the decision I'm making. Where I was like, oh, should I have this Jaffa cake or should I not have this Jaffa cake? And then and the whole thing's playing out. Like I'm like, this is dumb. Why am I thinking about this stupid thing that person said? But it just sits there. You're exposed to it so much.
Yeah, I agree. I think like people are trying to find this perfect like system nutritionally to be the best athlete, or just not even like a high level athlete, just to like look the best, feel the best. And everyone's so different. That's why you can't do studies on this properly, because there's too many variables. Everyone has different metabolisms, everyone has different stress, everyone has like just different things going on in their life and different diets and different needs, and it's impossible. And it's what I find frustrating is that a lot of these studies are like, oh yes, this study reveals that you should do this, not like for some people this may be a reasonable way to do things. But it's what I find frustrating in performance sport is you've got very influential athletes telling you like factually incorrect things, and they're women who are doing this, they're speaking to a massive group of like young girls who want to look like this person, want to ride like this person, and they're being told, oh yeah, you shouldn't eat carbs, or you shouldn't do this. And that is so damaging, because as a younger rider, or a younger person, like, you are impressionable, and you are going to listen to people who you think have authority on these things. And that's what I find really mad. And what the craziest thing I've learned about it is, the less I think about it, the healthier I am and the better I feel. And it sounds, I am well aware that it's not a simple process, but the two things that basically keep me on track and in a really good place with food is, I eat till I'm full, but like, I just eat till I'm not hungry anymore. And because I never really overeat at one time, because I'm always eating enough at every point. Like, I'm not depriving and then eating loads in one go and feeling uncomfortable, which I know is a really common thing of people who don't have a good relationship with their food. And the other thing is, like, if I'm wondering whether I should eat this thing, I should probably eat it, because I'm probably hungry for it. So just things like that. Like, I know even when I'm just, it's a rest day, and sometimes it's still on rest days, I'm like, oh, I don't need to eat this much. But I'm like, I just did like 5 hours training yesterday. I've got 4 hours tomorrow. Like, just eat the donut. And it's just really simple things like that. And I do think there should be, rather than going into all the science about how much we should be intaking, I think we should be having more conversations about, like, how do you feel? Do you want to eat this thing?
It's weird. It's like getting this balance between, there's a big problem. A lot of people are overweight, and that's something that we need to address. And one of the answers to that is eating less and doing more. But then a lot of people on the other side are very susceptible to all those messages. They're getting the messages of the losing weight messages, and kind of confusing it with what's healthy. Where actually, like, a lot of people need to just be, especially if you're doing as much exercise as like a professional athlete, you basically need to be eating as much as you can.
Yeah, totally. I think there's the more general discussion around health and weight, which is, there's an issue because health is too attached to somebody's appearance. You can have very slim people who are very unhealthy, but they might be like, oh, well, I'm vegan. And you're like, oh, you must be healthy. But like, it's so much more complicated than that. And then within sport, it's like, you get, I've totally forgotten what I was going to say to your point there.
We were just talking about this. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, people like going about it all the wrong way and getting attached to like these diets or these bad things, and this also misunderstanding around exercise, and how there not being enough emphasis on just, don't focus so much on what you're eating or how much you're eating. Just go for a walk every day. And like, because that's not only good for your physical health, we both know how good exercise is for mental health as well. And I just think there should be way more emphasis on that than there should be on try this diet or stop eating this and that.
Yeah, I think the whole message around a lot of stuff needs to just, like, everyone needs to just calm down a bit. Like, it puts people off, like these like intense workouts, and like, and even to a certain extent, some professional athletes, like, for the majority of people, the message should just be move around, and eat some vegetables, like, and don't overcomplicate it, because you're not gonna, you turn some people off, but with these like sort of more extreme messages, and you don't inspire others, and some people you end up causing all sorts of problems with, because they try and be that intense, and it doesn't necessarily, it's not a good thing. Yeah. If I think about, I remember watching this when I was like racing and completely obsessed with it. There's this YouTube video I used to watch called like How Bad Do You Want It?
Oh god.
It's just like, yeah, it was just like, it's funny as well, but I just got, it's like the guy was like he's saying like, you shouldn't sleep, you shouldn't eat, you should do nothing else, and I'm like, yeah, fuck yeah, okay, that's like, that's how I'm going to tackle this. And it's not a good idea. It doesn't work.
No,
It does not work.
yeah, it's crazy. Like I remember a week before a World Cup in 2017, I went to my mum's concert. She was playing flute in a concert, and the concert finished at about 9. I left halfway through the concert to go to bed early because I had a World Cup the week after. Even though the concert finished at 9, I was like just so obsessed. And I remember at every World Cup, every time I walked up a set of stairs, I'd be thinking about how my legs felt. And I'd just be like draining energy.
Yeah,
like I
totally.
would turn up at start lines exhausted. Like I started working with a sports psychologist last summer, and to be honest, he's probably like 80% of the reason I got fifth at Worlds, because he totally changed my outlook on racing. And the main thing he said to me was like, if you're thinking about this race for however long, like the race is an hour and a half, but you're turning up at the start line having already done like a week long of racing. So how do you expect to perform when all you've been doing is like that race has been in the front of your mind the whole time and you've not switched off? It just totally like changed how I thought about it, and how, like for me now, going into a race week, the best thing for me to do is pretend I don't have a race that weekend. And that doesn't mean, staying up late, eating shite, not sleeping and being stupid, but because that's not how I like to live my life anyway. I like going to bed early. I like eating well. It just meant go and like do something fun today, go swimming in that lake, or go and do this, and just not stressing about it and not thinking about it. And it means like I turned up at the start line fresh, with like a fresh head, and with no expectation either, because I don't know if you used to do this when you race, but you'd make all these predictions about what would happen. Like I used to do it all the time with races, and like you just can't. There's like 90 people on the start line. You can't predict what's going to happen. So yeah, that changed a lot.
Yeah, I remember doing exactly the same sort of things. I remember in school, especially once I sort of left school, and then it got like way too like very unhealthy for me, like obsession over racing. And I remember being at a party, and having to, and then leaving. And I like parties, but
I know you like parties.
but I let go of that, and that was actually a big, like I always enjoyed like going out and seeing people and hanging out with people, and I remember being at one and then like leaving at like 9 and then not drinking. Can you imagine?
Oh my god!
But I was sacrificing. I was isolating myself, especially because I'm extroverted. So like that actually ended up having a really damage. That was one of the reasons I probably stopped racing, because I couldn't actually. It was like I couldn't like really balance it. Mainly also financially as well as psychologically. But it's a really tough one. So it's literally as simple as that. You just do sort of fun, because it's one thing to say like, oh, it's one, actually affecting how you think. It's quite difficult. Is it? How have you done that?
So the main thing is I always try and make sure I have somebody that I can have fun with at a race. So I have been at a couple of races where the company has been not bad company, but it's just people that I'm not entirely myself around. And I find that I just can't relax, because then I'm inclined to go into my room and be by myself, because I don't want to be in this company. But then it makes it worse, because if I'm by myself, I'm just thinking about the race. So, like being around people who I can have fun with, whether that's my mechanic or my best friend who's also on the GB cycling team and that sort of thing. And the other thing is, I used to be really obsessed with my taper, in terms of like I'd have a lot of rest days leading into a race, like 3 rest days and 1 really easy day. And now I've realized all I was doing was like just making more time to sit and think about the race. So now in like the 4 days leading into the race, I ride my bike every day, even if it's just for like an hour, just because it's something to do. It's a way to leave. And a lot of the reason why I went to university was kind of create a balance that I had to engage with. which I now actually, I don't feel like I need uni really anymore, because I feel like I've got that balance, and I understand that it's necessary now, and I'm willing to nurture that. But uni was really useful for the last few years because it forced me away from racing. So yeah, it's just little things like that, and just trying to meet up with other racers or something when I'm away a trip, like texting someone and be like, do you want to do this? Do you want to go for a spin? But yeah, it takes a while to switch your mindset and understand like what is going to benefit you, and what is actually going to make everything the last few months a waste of time.
Yeah, super interesting. So Crystal doesn't want us to be too much longer than an hour, apparently, adds a lot of editing time onto him. But I do have a few more questions that I want to ask. What do you feel? We've talked quite a lot about this sort of some of the challenges of racing and the negative aspects of racing, but what do you think it has taught you that has been positive?
Wow, that's also a big question.
And what's the biggest lesson? I mean, obviously you're a professional athlete. It's taught you an awful lot. It's your career and everything else. But what do you think are some of the more like broad lessons that you think it's hard for, because you're probably going to be a professional athlete for the next, I don't know, 10, 15 years maybe. So it's maybe hard to sort of look like, oh, what am I going to take from sport into sort of normal life? But you can imagine what will be.
I think the biggest thing at the end of it all, when I'm retired, I don't think I'll look back and feel really content with like my performances and my races. I think I'll be really proud of the relationships that I've made and the people I've met, and what I love about sport is that every day is different and every trip is different, and you can never know where you're going to be in 6 months in terms of who you're going to be working with and who you're going to be involved with. And it's all these complex relationships that you develop from something so small as riding a bike. And these relationships can develop so many layers. And I think because you're involved, you're like surrounded by people who are all just as passionate as you. And that's something like really special, because it is a bond that you all share, and it is like a community. And especially during lockdown, it's been really nice for me to have this mountain biking community, which is worldwide, because it can be, with my friend in Kenya, or it can be with another girl from Canada that I race against or whatever. And I think just the experience of the world that you can have just from like professional sport, which is so much bigger than professional sport. And I always think about my one relationship with a girl who, she's a bit older than me, but we've raced each other for almost 10 years. And she's like another Scottish girl. And we just started kind of trying to kick each other's asses in races. And now we've been through so many different things in other parts of her life. Like her partner passed away, and we've both had these kind of like difficult experiences. And I always think like, this is so cool that a bike race can do this. I don't know if I've answered your question, but
I think I've asked you what it's taught you, but I think you've answered the question, like, what are you going to take from it? Maybe fight from it.
Yeah. I struggle, like what it's like, it's taught me exactly who I want to be in life, but that's like a big, I think,
I was going to say it's easier for me to answer that question, because I sort of had this like brief, intense kind of period of racing, and then I kind of let it go and kind of went through some things there, and then coming out the other side, I'm like, oh, okay, like I see what I learned from racing. But for you, it's harder because it's harder to detach yourself from. Much harder.
Yeah, like I can feel very wise and mature now and think about all the things racing's taught me over the past 5 years. But in another 5 years, I'll look back at me now and think, wow, I really didn't know very much then. So I think, I would have to step away from it to understand what is taught me, because
to have the
it's
perspective.
me all the time.
What then are your ambitions for the future, racing and beyond?
So, do you want the obvious boring ones?
Well, obviously the race results. Yeah, I want to win. I want to win. Yeah, so I'll assume those ones.
Yeah.
But then maybe, yeah, those ones are, I suppose, more boring. What do you want to do after your racing career?
So it's funny because lockdown has made me really worried about retiring from racing because I don't know what I would do without this lifestyle because I love it and I love being a professional athlete and everything that comes with that. So I have been thinking about it quite a lot recently. And I've always said I want to transition into ultra running when I'm like mid 30s and 40s. And like I do really want to do that because I love running and I love being in the mountains. But I kind of realized recently that the reason I want to do that is because I want to delay not being a professional athlete for as long as possible. But I think more recently as well, I never thought I would want to stay in the industry. I thought I would want to leave and do something else. But now I've realized I really want to continue to make positive change in the sport and help people in the sport because I will have this valuable bank of knowledge by the time I retire, which I think could potentially be wasted if I went into something else. I think I could do a lot of good if I set my mind to it in terms of like what we were talking about earlier, with helping different people access the sport. Or I did, because I'm doing a biology and nutrition degree at uni, I did think for ages that I wanted to go into sports nutrition to help riders struggling with the relationships with food and stuff. But I actually took a sociology module this summer, kind of in line with my recent engagement with discrimination and the Black Lives Matter movement and stuff. And I pretty much have already decided that I want to change my degree and do a sociology degree because that would obviously give me a lot more credibility in terms of being able to tie in my time racing in the sport and my experience there with something bigger and more important that reach a much bigger group of people. So that's kind of, it's quite vague right now, but
I think though after being like you will have a platform and credibility to really do something that is beneficial for the sport after a career and especially a successful career.
Yeah, I like to think so. Like I heard somebody say something quite recently, and it's so true because I've been feeling I'm not doing something useful enough in the world. I want to do something bigger and help more people and not just look out for myself. But the way in which you do that is, it's a lot easier to do that when you have a platform and you have the knowledge and you have the years of experience and you because right now my ideas are a bit vague. And that whoever had said, I can't remember who it was, they said, what you need to do now is focus on your career as a bike rider, and then you can move onto this when you have a better idea of what it is and you have a bigger voice and bigger platform and better resources and more people behind you. That's when you can make a real change. And I really like that because it is true. You do need that presence, and the people behind you in order to make big useful changes.
Yeah, you can't do everything all at once.
No. Can't.
And finally, then, what advice would you give to a young girl looking to get into mountain biking?
I would say that training and thinking about structure is the last thing that should be on your mind right now. And what your focus should be is going riding for fun and involving yourself in different opportunities and different sports and different hobbies. Because yes, you might be an aspiring rider right now, but you might find something else that you're really passionate about, that you love. And I see it a lot when I see 13 and 14-year-olds asking me for training advice. And I'm like, don't train. Like, seriously, I just think there's people suck the enjoyment out of riding a bike. And I'm sure they do it in other sports, but I see it like with parents and stuff with their kids. And I just think it's a shame, because bike riding is so cool, and you don't have to become a professional for it to be this like a central part of your life. And I see a lot of people who fall out of love with it because of that. So I would just say, don't worry that you need to do things now, because the 14-year-old, you have 25 years to be the best. And you don't need to start trying to be the best until you're actually an adult as well, when you're fully grown and, you know, your friends aren't beating you because they're bigger than you.
Totally. That is such a, especially to like a competitive young person, that's like, it is, you know, you don't have the perspective until you're an adult, and then you're just like, oh, like there really wasn't that much of a rush. But at the time, it just seems, you know, it just seems the world is so important. Like, it's stupidly out of sync with reality, you know?
Yeah. But when you're that young, like, you do need, if you're really passionate about something, it is nice to get the motivation from winning and from, you know, getting that kudos from your peers and everyone. But at the same time, it sounds so harsh, but it really means nothing in the long term. It's nice at that time, and maybe it's motivational, but I didn't really win things until I was 17 or 18. And because I didn't, that like gave me the opportunity to learn what it was that I wanted to do, why I loved the sport. And it wasn't because I won, because I wasn't winning. So I just had this loads of years of learning why I was doing it. And I think that's why it's been a lot more organic and genuine for me coming through, because it was never based on me being the best at that time.
All right. Sorry, Crystal. We've gone over the hour. More work for him. But thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed listening to you. And I think you've said some good things.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for having me. It's been good. It's actually been really good to talk about some of the stuff that's in my brain the past year on some sort of platform. So it's been
I think
nice.
Some people will definitely be people. I don't want to sort of like, it's funny because I want to compliment everything you said, but then I don't want to sort of self-gratify it being our podcast and saying like, yeah, this is going to have a really big impact on people. But I think do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I think it could, you know, because of your involvement, not mine.
Yeah, I hope so. No, I'm glad that we talked about these things.
All right, I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, as I said at the beginning, as I say in every episode, please like, comment, and subscribe. We will answer your questions. We will supply you with great videos, 6 o'clock every Thursday, and we will appreciate your feedback. So thank you so much for watching, and see you next week.